France or Spain, but Catalonia. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera.
Now, November the 11th is Poland's Independence Day, but in recent years it's also become the focus of right-wing nationalism. An annual right-wing march is held through the capital, Warsaw, which last year was joined by more than 75,000 people. David Chater has more.
The organisers of this march say they expect up to 100,000 protesters to take to the streets of Warsaw. This means it's one of the biggest ever gatherings of the far right in Europe. The policies that they've been expounding on, and the speakers here have been claiming essentially that they want to keep Poland for the Poles. They're very much against the immigrants and the refugees that are coming into Europe. They say, even the leader of the governing party here says they're bringing in parasites and disease to Poland. These are the views that are now being expressed both by these far-right groups gathering here and also inside the government itself. Now, the police are on the sidelines. They're keeping to the back streets, but they have water cannons and large reserves in case of trouble. There are counter-demonstrators also moving through the capital, and police do expect there could be clashes. But at the moment, they're staying on the sidelines, waiting to see what the day will bring.
Now, the world's biggest online shopping spree, Singles Day, has opened in China, and it's already breaking records. The e-commerce giant Alibaba says sales topped $1.5 billion in just the first 3 minutes of shopping. Step Varsing reports from Beijing.
Convenient, cheap, and some say addictive. Online sales are going through the roof in China. An electric tooth flosser caught with the chain's eye. Discount 20%. He rarely visits a store these days. Laptop, fitness equipment, cameras, all bought with a few clicks. And many other items he admits he doesn't even need.
Sometimes I do overconsume online, especially when they are on sale. A lot of times I buy them without thinking too much, and never touch them again after I open the package. Even if I don't like them, I will return because later.
Singles Day started in the 1990s as a response to Valentine's Day, but it has gone far beyond people's relationship status. Online giant Alibaba managed to turn what's now called Double 11 into a shopping spectacle that captivates most of China. Exactly at midnight on November 11, discounts appear online, and the buying spree
Version of their joint statement hours after the Kremlin. US President Donald Trump and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin met on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Vietnam. Both leaders confirmed their commitment to maintaining Syria's sovereignty.
Just now, we've adopted that document with the President of the United States. It's a very crucial document because we set forth some principal things. Firstly, we continue the fight against terrorism in Syria. That's the most important for the United States and for us, especially in light of recent tragic events which happened there to do with recent terrorist acts. As I've said, we've been confronting that evil for quite some time now. It's important for the whole international community that we continue to apply joint efforts.
Iraqi forces have launched an offensive to capture Mehdi Hassan is coming up next. Thank you for watching.
A mass exodus. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya have fled ethnic cleansing in Myanmar for Bangladesh, one of the world's poorest countries. 101 East investigates what their future holds. At this time on Al Jazeera.
As President Donald Trump sends more US troops to fight the war in Afghanistan, the ICC prosecutor is calling for an investigation into war crimes in that country. So how complicit have Afghan authorities been? I'll ask this week's headliner, former President of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. Hamid Karzai, thanks for joining me on Upfront. In August, US President Donald Trump announced his plan to escalate the US involvement in Afghanistan, America's longest ever war, and to send more US troops to fight the Taliban. You tweeted that you strongly oppose this new US strategy, that it's, quote, against the national interest of Afghanistan. How is it against the national interest of your country to have your allies sending you more troops to fight the #1 threat to peace in your country, the Taliban?
The Afghan people are sick and tired of war, in whatever name that may be. When we welcomed the United States in Afghanistan in 2001, the Afghan people, for the first time, accepted and supported and welcomed a foreign military power, in the hope that finally we will have peace and progress and stability. And for a number of years, that was true. But when
crimes of torture and related ill treatment by Afghan government forces did take place, let's be clear, that was on your watch as president of Afghanistan.
Yes, she is right. She is right to launch such an investigation. That's exactly why things have gone wrong in Afghanistan, violation of the lives of the Afghan people. That's exactly why I began to have differences with the United States and with their heavy-handed approach.
Do you agree that there were human rights violations by Afghan security forces while you were president? Were you aware of them at the time?
Definitely there were violations by the Afghan security forces, by the US, and by others. And that is exactly the reason that I'm asking for peace in Afghanistan.
Okay, but do you take responsibility
exactly the reason
for
that
those
I did not
violations
sign the bilateral
as head of
security agreement
state
with the US?
Do you take responsibility as head of state at that time for those violations?
Surely, very much. I've spoken about this before. I have issued instructions on this before. I've issued instructions to our intelligence department, to our defense department, to our internal Minister of Interior, repeatedly in cabinet meetings, through written instructions. How could we be so much in trouble if there were no violations? And that's exactly the pain of the Afghan people for the past 30 years. Violations at the hands of our own government and violations perpetrated by foreigners. It is this that must end. Definitely. We have to go to those roots in order to have peace in Afghanistan.
So if the ICC prosecutor comes after you personally, you will cooperate with her. You'll be willing to be interviewed, give evidence, etc.
Like hell, of course. Absolutely. Welcome. And I have been asking for this so that they come to Afghanistan and investigate as to what has happened in this country.
Hamid Karzai, can I just clarify for the sake of our audience how this is obviously a big legal and political issue. When you say you welcome the ICC investigation, like hell, you'll cooperate with them, you'll definitely cooperate with them. Are you saying you admit to guilt in relation to war crimes that took place on your watch? You're saying they did happen? Or are you saying, yes, let's have an investigation, but you're not sure what happened?
No, I'm admitting morality and an upper hand and on high ground on morality in this issue. Okay. I want those who have done it to be taken into account.
Are you one of those who did it as the Commander-in-Chief of Afghan Armed Forces, former at the time?
No. I'm one of those who stood against it.
Okay.
We firmly and clearly and in writing. And that is the issue of difference between me and the United States on this issue. That is where things went wrong between us.
Many human rights groups say they told you at the time torture was going on, detention was going on, abuse was going on, and your government did nothing. That's what a lot of human rights groups would say.
No, they're wrong. They didn't tell me, I told them.
Okay.
I told the Western human rights bodies as to what was going on in Afghanistan.
Okay.
They didn't tell me. They were hiding it. The Western or violence in Afghanistan. Here, Afghanistan is used as a pretext to put pressure on Pakistan because of the larger issues that are not related to Afghanistan immediately. It is for this reason that, again, I oppose this, because it uses Afghanistan in a bigger game for someone else's interest. With Pakistan, we have our differences, we have our issues. Yes, a lot of violence has come to Afghanistan from Pakistan, but that is an issue that we must address directly to Pakistan, as the US and others must help that issue, not to use us as a pretext for a larger confrontation in this region.
Hamid Karzai, you told me on this show in 2015 that ISIL in Afghanistan has no ground here at all. There is no element, there is no medium for them to grow or rise or strengthen. And yet just this year, ISIL has carried out more than 20 attacks inside of Afghanistan. Afghan officials say there are more than 1,500 ISIL fighters on the ground in your country. Do you think you spoke too soon?
No. What I meant there was that they are not Afghans, but they are foreign nurtured for a foreign purpose, that they are not indigenous to us.
But they clearly have support now inside of Afghanistan.
They don't have any support inside Afghanistan. They're clearly funded by abroad and for a purpose related to abroad.
You mentioned abroad. You've accused the United States of being behind
Killing
ISIL.
Afghan people.
You have said, quote, I do not differentiate at all between Daesh and America. You've said ISIL is, quote, a US tool and that unmarked military helicopters are supplying ISIL in Afghanistan. Do you have even a shred of evidence for what are pretty controversial and inflammatory claims?
The evidence is still in the fact that they are there. In spite of the US presence in Afghanistan to fight extremism, ISIS emerged under their watch when Afghanistan is completely under their air surveillance.
But that's evidence of US failure in
No
prosecuting
plane
the
can
war on
fly
terror.
without
That's not
detection.
evidence of US complicity. You're claiming complicity. You're saying US and ISIS are working together, which is a big claim.
We have more than that. Look, we have suffered so much in this game that never a moral being will be able to deny that extremism is a tool in the hands of the United States. They did it when we were fighting the Soviets, the same tool. They're using it in a bigger way now today.
Just to be clear, are you claiming that President Donald Trump is working with ISIS in Afghanistan?
Well, these are inflammatory statements that they're trying to make today. I'm not going to make this.
You said I can,
But I'm telling you as an Afghan,
I do not differentiate
Daesh
between Daesh and America. They get unmarked military helicopters.
Yes.
Those are your claims, not mine. They're your inflammatory
Yes,
claims.
yes, I am saying that, but I'm not going to link President Trump to this. I mean, this is linking individuals. I'm talking of a system. Therefore, for me to link an individual is not the right thing.
Okay, let me rephrase the question then. Is the Trump administration, the US government, working with ISIS in Afghanistan?
In my view, under the full presence, surveillance, military, political, intelligence, Daesh has emerged. And for 2 years, the Afghan people came, cried aloud of their suffering, of violations. Nothing was done. And then they dropped a bomb, the biggest non-nuclear bomb, on our people in the name of fighting Daesh. And the next day, Daesh takes the next district in Afghanistan. That proves to us that there is a hand in it, and that hand can be no one else but them in Afghanistan. If that is not the case, I will go back to my original statement to you. Let them come back to the Afghan people and say that they have failed. Then we will sit down with them and redraw a map of cooperation.
With the benefit of hindsight, Hamid Karzai, looking back 16 years on from 9/11 and the original intervention,
to us, we as a people are very grateful to the help that has been given to us, which we consider help. Where our hospitals are built, where our schools are built, where our roads are built, where life has improved, we're very grateful to the American people. But you cannot tell me that I've given you money, so I have the right to bomb your house. And if I complain, don't bomb my house, you say, well, that's not gratefulness. We differentiate. Where we are helped, we are grateful. Where we are bombed, imprisoned, hurt, we are not grateful. We stand against it.
Hamid Karzai, thanks for joining me on Upfront.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
This month, the US government released an exhaustive scientific report on climate change, citing humans as the dominant cause of global warming. So, should we still be optimistic about humanity's ability to combat climate change? Earlier, I spoke with Andrew Friedman, senior science editor at Mashable, and David Wallace-Wells, the author of a controversial New York Magazine article titled The Uninhabitable Earth, which paints a pessimistic doomsday scenario for the planet. I began by asking David why he chose such a fatalistic approach.
My goal was to do a survey of the science's best understanding of worst-case climate scenarios. So what I did was I took the UN's projection for what their median projection for how warm the planet would get without human action to halt emissions, which is about 5 degrees, and I took their projection for the high end of how warm the planet would get by 2100 if we took no action, which was about 8 degrees. And I took that to a series of scientists with specialties in certain subfields and basically asked them what those temperatures would mean for their areas of expertise, what it would mean for agricultural production, what it would mean for heat stress, what it would mean for...
And all the answers were pretty dire, weren't they?
They were, and you know, I want to be clear here, as I think I was in the article, although some of my critics missed it, that what I was presenting was really a absolute worst-case survey, and one of the things I wanted to do was show readers how that spectrum of terrifying possibilities could unfold.
Well, let me put that point to Andrew Friedman. Andrew, you're a science writer who spent more than a decade covering climate change. In your view, what are the odds, the chances of all this, or much of this, actually happening, of the Earth becoming partially uninhabitable by the end of this century, for example, as David has suggested? Or is this, as some of David's critics have suggested, all just climate disaster porn?
You know, it is very unlikely. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. But I would say, you know, and that sort of gets to my central criticism of the piece, and I think what was a lot of people's criticism in the climate community, which is that it didn't really get across the probabilities of the scenario that he was presenting. So I have very little problems with the dire scenarios that he presented, in the sense that here's how they would play out. I don't think that he you know, made fundamental mistakes in how those scenarios might play out. However, the reader comes away from that piece feeling terrified and not understanding really what the likelihood is of those terrifying outcomes versus somewhat less terrifying outcomes, or even, you know, more manageable outcomes.
Andrew, let me ask you this. A lot of people, when they do look at climate science or read stories about climate science, you know, they come away thinking, oh, it's bad because we're going to have rising sea levels, or because we're going to have a bit more extreme weather, a few more hurricanes. What's wrong with simply making the public aware of just how bad things are?
And is calling for restraints.
And Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has offered to host an international human rights summit. But rights groups say that he's not fit to lead such an event. We'll tell you why. I'm Andy Chappelle. Connect with us throughout the show using the hashtag AJNewsGrid.
The Lebanese parliament is divided equally among Muslims and Christians. The most powerful political forces include Shia and Sunni Muslims, Maronite and Greek Orthodox Christians, and members of the Druze faith. Under an earlier pact, Lebanon's president must be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament a Shia Muslim. Now, external political alliances add further complications. Saad Hariri and his Sunni political movement are backed by Saudi Arabia, while their Shia rivals Hezbollah are allied with Iran. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Zaina Hodder, who is in Beirut, the Lebanese capital force. Zaina, so 1 week since Saad Hariri's shock resignation from Riyadh, what's the word for us on his fate? What's going to happen if he doesn't return to Lebanon?
Well, like you mentioned, the president of the country asking Saudi Arabia to clarify if and when Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri will be returning to Lebanon. The president believes the prime minister is detained. He's under house arrest. And it's not just the president. The prime minister's own political party has suggested and implied that they too believe that the prime minister does not enjoy the freedom of movement. So what is next? Well, according to the constitution, the president should hold parliamentary consultations to appoint a new prime minister. But the president is refusing to do that because he's not accepting Hariri's resignation. He wants Hariri to return to Lebanon to explain the circumstances behind his resignation. And yes, Lebanon is a parliamentary democracy fully, but it is also a consensual democracy. The president cannot appoint a prime minister who's not a consensual candidate because it will not resolve the instability in the country. All sides should agree on the next prime minister. If the next prime minister is seen to be close to Iran, it will isolate Lebanon. It will isolate the Sunni community. And what Sunni politician, whose Sunni politician is ready to take this post, it will be political suicide.
What's at stake then, Zaina, for the different political factions in Lebanon? As we saw, a very complicated arrangement there. They've managed to come together, it seems, in a rare political consensus, putting their differences aside. But how long will that last?
Well, yes, a rare consensus, rare unity. They're putting their political differences aside, but this is a deeply divided country, especially concerning Hezbollah's arms. There is a group in Lebanon who considers Hezbollah created a state within a state. They want Hezbollah to disarm. Hezbollah's armed wing is even stronger than the national army. Now, Hezbollah, for example, does not disarm, does not disengage itself from regional conflicts, pull its troops from Syria. If something happens in Lebanon, if threats against Lebanon are carried out, then Hezbollah will risk losing support. Hezbollah is always trying to portray itself as a Lebanese party, but it does not deny its links with Iran, and it has political opponents here. That's Hezbollah. But what about the Sunni community? The Sunni community today, I can tell you, they feel marginalized. They are upset at Saudi Arabia. We were just in a Sunni neighborhood, a Hariri stronghold, a few hours ago, and what the people were telling us was that this is unacceptable what Saudi Arabia has done. Lebanon will demand that the Prime Minister is returned. He is a loss for Lebanon. He's a loss for us as a community because they see him as their leader.
Zaina Hodder in Beirut.